glad to welcome Professor Molly Brunson here from Yale. My name is Eric Scott. I'm the director of KU Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. I see Molly has a handout she's giving out right now. We're really happy to have Professor Brunson here today as part of our Reframe series. This series is one we developed in light of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and is really geared towards rethinking and reevaluating the nature of our field, and really trying to highlight scholars whose work pushes beyond the conventional boundaries, conventional understandings that are present in Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies. Before I introduce Professor Brunson, I did also want to mention we have a second talk in this series coming up on Tuesday of next week. Professor Adrian Edgar of UC Santa Barbara will be here 4 p.m. on Tuesday in the Kansas Union Alderson Room. She'll be talking about intermarriage in the Soviet Union and what this means for our understanding of the multi-ethnic empire of the USSR. So her talk is intermarriage and the friendship of the peoples. The next in our Reframe series on Tuesday at 4. So we have kind of an embarrassment of riches in this next week or so. Professor Molly Brunson is associate professor in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at Yale University. She has a secondary appointment in the Department of History of Art, which will, I think, make a lot more sense when you see her presentation and her interdisciplinary and multimedia approach to the history of Russian, East European, and Eurasian culture. Her specialty is literature and visual art in the 19th and 20th centuries, with an emphasis on realisms, multiple and recurrent realisms that have emerged in imperial Russia and the Soviet Union. Her first book, award-winning book, was Russian Realism, Literature and Painting, 1840 to 1890, which linked literature and painting and won the award for Best Book in Cultural Studies from the American Association of Teachers of Slavic and East European Languages. Her current book project is The Russian Point of View, Perspective in the Birth of Modern Russian Culture, and she's been working on that. And she's also working on a third book, which I think we're going to get a sense of today, entitled The Underground Mining and Matter in Russian and Soviet Culture. Her talk today is entitled Paint It Black, Art Mining in the Donbas in the 1890s. And yes, this image is, as you might notice, quite sharp, examining how industry, in particular mining, was represented in industrial Russia. So again, bringing in yet sort of a third dimension in the study of literature, painting, but also energy. And she's we'll be talking about Nikolai Kasatkin, who was, she calls arguably Russia's first modern painter of coal. She'll also be looking at journalistic writing and the transnational visual culture of mining. And so, again, I'm really, really excited to bring her here. I think this is really at the forefront of our field in terms of looking at painting, literature, environmental studies, and economic activity as it's visually and textually represented. So please join me in welcoming Professor Molly Brunson. I will now turn down the lights so you can really enjoy the image here.
So how is the mic? Am I mic'd properly? We're going. Okay, great. And we're going to go dark, and you'll understand why this is necessary and throughout the lecture today. Although, in acknowledgement of how difficult it is to see some of the works I'm going to be presenting, I did pass around a handout, one with a printout of one of the main images I'll be looking at, which gives you somewhat of a better sense, although you see it still is hard to discern much, and that's kind of the point. But the other handout is with some of the primary citations I'll be referring to, and I pass that out both so you have a souvenir, because who doesn't like that, but also I recognize that some like to doodle and various other kinds of modes of inscription during talks. So you have that in case that is useful to you. Let me begin by offering really enormous thanks, both to Eric for the invitation to come here. It really is such a delight to be here. I happen to really enjoy the apocalyptic windy weather. So that has been a special bonus, but also true special thanks to Ezra for being really just a tremendous host during the planning and also the arrival so far. You have really a very special community here. So let's get started. If I asked you what labor looked like in 19th century Russia, imperial Russia, you might imagine something like this. Grueling, relentless, brutal, as is the case with Ilya Repin's barge haulers, or swallowed up by the bounty of Russian agriculture, as we see in Grigory Myasayedov's mowers from a decade later. Now, in each picture, this is a labor that prioritizes an idealized peasantry over the pressures of modernity that have been dramatically reshaping the workforce and landscape in the Russian Empire as well as around the globe. Of course, there is a steamship in the far-right background of Repin's painting, but this is only just enough industrial presence to highlight the extreme anachronism of the barge haulers themselves. In fact, certain critics of the time noted that these laboring men seemed almost as if they had emerged from myth, from legend. Myasayedov doesn't even attempt this minimal puff of steam. Instead, his peasants occupy an utterly timeless world, pastoral, idyllic, barely breaking a sweat, with a charming crown of grain looped around one man's head. There is no modern machinery here. There is not even a whiff that there ever might be. Both paintings rely on bands of blue sky and golden ground to place their subjects within an aesthetically pleasing space and, we're led to believe, an infinitely rich natural resource. It's a mostly harmonious pairing of peasants and land, without much sense of the troubles lurking below the surface of both. So in my talk today, I will speak precisely about what is lurking beneath such scenes of idyllic labor. And I will do so again, literally, by going underground. Where we find paintings of Donbas coal mining that Nikolai Kasatkin produced in the 1890s. At the time, the Donbas, located in present-day Ukraine, was one of the most highly industrialized regions of the Russian Empire. In traveling there, Kasatkin sought a representation of the modern worker in the mines and factories that dotted the rapidly changing landscape. In the three major works from this period, which you see here, we see Kasatkin going deeper and deeper to find his subject, from the ravaged steppe to the pithead elevator to the subterranean caverns. And in tracking this descent, we might be tempted to ask, how is it possible for painting, let alone realist painting, to represent mining, which took place predominantly in dark underground spaces, beyond the scope of human vision? How was one meant to picture the unpicturable? In fact, maybe because of Russian realism's undeniable preoccupation with populist themes, with peasants and agriculture, it was often difficult for artists and writers to see industrialism at all. My interest then is what happens when they do. What do Russian painters see when they train their eye not on idealized populist fantasies, but on the conditions of modern labor? What does Kasatkin do when faced with this aesthetic challenge? Now, a comparison of one of Kasatkin's preparatory sketches with the final canvas for coal miners' shift change tells the story in sum. He paints it black. He takes a packed but legible multi-figure composition set in the interior of a pithead, with the elevator going down to the mines seen in the background. He takes the crisscrossing beams of the ceiling structure. He takes the faces of the men and the figures sprawled on the floor, and he paints it all black. He paints it so black that the picture is nearly impervious to vision. And this is not just you, by the way, although I will admit that it is easier to see these images on a computer screen than it is projected on the wall. And this is partly because of the tremendous advances of digital technology and the brightness of a computer screen. But actually, I think when faced with these works in person, it would still be very, very hard to see. So you're not missing anything that isn't, in fact, intended to be missed. Although I will try to help you see it a little bit better. So in my talk today, I'll ask why Kasatkin makes this choice. Why does he go dark? This was not an obvious choice. There were plenty of alternative models that would have allowed for more illuminating pictures of the underground. But in seeking to reveal Imperial Russia's industrial workforce, Kasatkin reorients his realist aesthetic. His Donbas pictures refuse to do the thing that realism had famously sought to do, expose unseen corners of reality. Instead, they withhold. They withhold vision. They frustratingly, tantalizingly withhold. And in doing so, they bring realism to the brink, albeit a triumphant one. But they also expand the reach of painting as a medium. Troubling the image-making potential of painterly representation, these works make a series of arguments about what painting, in the absence of visibility, might become: opaque, tactile, charged with material and political energy. Now, this talk is part of a book on the underground and mining in Russian and Soviet artistic culture, which has been inspired by efforts in Slavic but also adjacent fields to excavate histories and objects that have until now been overlooked. The 3 chapters of the book are each structured on 3 distinct historical moments and places, each combining close analysis of literature, visual and material culture, and the decorative arts. The first chapter takes up mining in the Ural Mountains during the 19th century, looking at landscapes that depict surface mining, the production of fine arts objects out of minerals and hardstone, and the curious resonance of these regional traditions and Pavel Bajov's Ural folktales from the Soviet period. The third chapter considers the mines of Soviet Siberia, both in Kuzbas and Kolyma, during the 1930s and 1940s. The big questions here then have to do with the uncomfortable parallels between voluntary and forced labor in the Soviet mines, but also the materiality of representation, of text and image on paper. And I'll get at these concerns by focusing primarily on graphic works, posters, drawings, designs, and of course, Shalamov's Kolyma tales. Now, sandwiched between these 2 moments is a chapter on Donbas coal mining in the 1890s, and this is what I'm going to be presenting to you today. The big task of this project is to trace how industrial mining became the subject, but also produced the very materials for Russian imperial and Soviet culture. And also to tell a story about a Russian art of industry that does not begin with socialism, but that extends far back into the pre-revolutionary period, and that intersects meaningfully with global histories of art, industry, and the environment. What anchors these discrete cases, or these discrete case studies, is the overall concept of the underground, the subterranean. Now, in a certain fundamental sense, I take the underground to be a decidedly material, earthly substance that contains riches, as well as mysteries and dangers. It is a geological space. It's available for excavation, but it's also an industrial space. It represents matter to be moved, reshaped, and mined for energy and technological development. The underground is also a space with a stunningly universal mythology. The underworld, the space of the dead and the sacred, of magical creatures and unknown worlds. Historian of science and technology Rosalind Williams takes these ancient myths of the underground to be so universal that she wonders if the vertical axis might even be inscribed into human DNA. Might we have been born to think of our world as divided into the above and the below? Recent scholarship in environmental humanities has centered our attention on the underground as a space of resource extraction. Extraction in the arts, then, becomes a vehicle for both industrial utopianism, we can power the world forever, or creeping climate anxiety. We might, in fact, exhaust these very resources. With both of these positions impressed into the very forms and structures of artistic representation. Now, for the Slavists in the room, we know well how powerful the psychological and ideological associations of the underground can be. While not earthen, Dostoevsky's underground is our most important example. And yet other disciplines have magnified further the significance of the underground for 19th century histories of politics and race. We need think here only of the Underground Railroad and the association of the subterranean with race and resistance. Among art historians, extraction has invited fresh questions about the materiality of art. How, for example, might we challenge an image-centric methodology and reorient ourselves toward materiality and labor. So yes, we can analyze photographs of mining like the one we see here, but might we also consider that what is being mined are the very metals and minerals that go into the production of photography itself? So in this study, I am trying to bring all of these perspectives together, this sort of vast hermeneutic potential of the underground. And you'll hear echoes of them all today. I'll foreground Kasatkin's works from a formal and aesthetic perspective, but always within broader environmental, sociopolitical, and material contexts. And so in a certain way then, I imagine this project as something of an experiment in what we might see, what images, what stories, what experiences we might see when we introduce a radical interdisciplinarity to 19th century Russian culture. So here we go. Coal. Coal had been discovered in the Donbas as early as 1724 by an English surveyor. And by the end of the 18th century, the Russian government accepted a plan to establish a smelter and foundry on the Luhan River. Although this site would be plagued by difficulties, it established the general outlines of a Donbas industry in iron and coal. And you'll note here on this geological map, where is it? Right here, the gray portion, that this is the Carboniferous zone that is identified in the 18th century, in the 18th century, and then becomes the sort of reason for building this coal industry in what would come to be known as the Donbas in the 19th century. Now, not long after the production of this map, coal extraction in the Donbas would reach a frenzied peak, largely inspired by the expansion of the railroad and the realization that industry had to accelerate after the failure of the Crimean War. Mines and factories began to crop up with great speed, starting in the 1860s. By 1884, there were 57 coal mines in the Donbas, 46 of which had been opened in just the prior 2 decades. And by the turn of the century, coal consumption had doubled in the Russian Empire. It came to be known as the coal craze. Which is not to say that mining hadn't existed in Russia before then. As these landscapes by regional artists attest, the Ural Mountains were already known for their long-standing history of ore mining. And so unsurprisingly, it was experts from the Urals who were shipped to the Donbas during the coal craze to share their technical skills. They would work alongside experts and entrepreneurs from the West, and mainly from Britain, home of the Industrial Revolution. The importance of industry in Great Britain had produced by the early 19th century a vibrant visual culture around coal, not only in the quaint pictures of mining towns in South Wales, but in the convention-shattering landscapes of Turner himself, painter of the sun, of light to be sure, but also of the choking smokestacks of industrial Britain. Although the occasional trail of black smoke or sooty street can be glimpsed in the painting of Russian realism, it really isn't until the very end of the century, the 1890s, that Russia would get its first true painter of coal. By then, Nikolai Kasatkin had graduated from the Moscow School of Painting and Architecture, having trained with their preeminent landscape and genre painters, and during the 1880s, he made a name for himself. Enough so that in 1891, he began exhibiting with the Wanderers, or Передвижники. This was the premier artistic organization in Imperial Russia, known for their promotion of a socially inflected and often unsparing realism of the kind we see Kasatkin practicing here. In 1894, we might imagine that Kasatkin was looking for a fresh subject, a subject that would launch a new phase of his career. And so he travels to the small town of Alexandrovsk to the Grushevsky mine. He rents 2 rooms and he gets to work. And he immediately begins complaining about the very harsh conditions. The wind and the heat of the steppe are absolutely punishing. Dust covers everything. In a letter to Tatiana Tolstaya, daughter of Lev Tolstoy, Kasatkin writes of the wretched, somewhat windswept steppe with mines scattered across it, with chimneys and dark buildings incessantly puffing white smoke among the black dispersed heaps of coal. Here and there between the village and the black mines stroll black people, men, women, and children. Here the general palette is one of black tones. In his first major canvas from the Donbas, Poor Gathering Coal at a Spent Mine, it would seem that Kasatkin approached this aesthetic resistance of the Donbas obliquely by exploring not the mines or the miners themselves, but rather their effects. This then is a painting not necessarily about modern industry as such, but about the ravages it has bestowed upon the land and its inhabitants. The composition gives the impression of the uninterrupted horizon line of a quintessential steppe view that has been dug up. In the left background, a factory stands atop a jagged outcropping of spoil and soil, violently sliced through on its right side. In the right background, we see a rolling hill and a distant smokestack. We might even wonder whether this hill is natural or yet another coal tip. With the background squeezed against the top edge of the frame, leaving only a modest sliver of blue sky, the ground plane dominates the majority of the picture. It's here where we find the ostensible subjects of the painting, a group of women and children picking through the spoil to find bits of coal, either to use as fuel in their homes or to sell for modest sums. With their canvas bags and wooden tools blending with the hastily sketched topes of the ground, the women and children threaten to disappear into the land itself. If we compare the final painting with one of its preparatory sketches, it becomes clear that Kasatkin almost sought to bury the central figures. Unlike in the sketch on the left, in the completed picture, no human figure breaks the horizon line. Just like the underground huts in which they lived, the zemlyanki, the people too are swallowed by the land. And indeed, if we look long enough, we might notice that this is exactly what has happened to the painting's middle ground. Dark figures emerge from and fade into the dark land. And we can see them. It's very hard to see in this particular projection. But if you look here, you see shapes beginning to emerge in the middle ground. So this then is how Kasatkin accesses the coal industry in his first Donbas summer. He forgoes the verdant colors of a landscape painting for the muted, murky palette of an earthen world. The fecundity of the breastfeeding woman on the right, herself an emblem of nature and living organisms, gives way to the coal-blackened figures in the middle ground, almost as if these women and children, buried underneath the ground, will themselves turn into geological strata to be mined, the peasants absorbed into the very energy source they're gathering. Kasatkin will travel back to the Donbas for the next several years, painting this work in 1895 and this in 1896. Now, although at first the miners were understandably suspicious of the visiting artist from the city, these pictures suggest that Kasatkin's access to the local community increased with every passing summer. When looked at as a corpus, the overwhelming impression is of Kasatkin descending further and further underground as the years go by. And yet I have to admit here that in my research I have found no evidence that Kasatkin himself ever descended into the mines. But in a certain way, it doesn't really matter whether he did or didn't. And the reason for that is that because by the 1890s, there was already a vast well of underground imagery from which Kasatkin could have drawn for inspiration. He may have even read about it in the local newspapers. During this time, there were a number of reporters, amateur and professional, traveling through the Donbas. They were writing about the explosion in industry, its social and political ramifications, and the empire's new class of capitalist entrepreneurs and industrial laborers. One of them was Alexander Kuprin, who would become known for his novels and short stories about Russian socio-historical realities during the turn of the century. But when we meet him, he was only at the very beginning of his career. In 1894, he resigned from his military post and started working as a traveling correspondent for local Ukrainian newspapers. Kuprin would publish several short sketches on the mines and factories of the Donbas, some appearing in print in 1896 and others later in the decade. One sketch, In the Main Mine, was based on material from his travel notebooks and published in 1899 in the newspaper Kiev Word, or Kievskaya Slova. This short text is written in the genre of a realist sketch, or ocherk, a kind of journalistic feuilleton meant to expose an overlooked corner of life for its readers. It's told in the first-person perspective. Presumably our narrator is a correspondent who has been dispatched to the Donbas mining region, what he calls Ruskaya Amerika, or Russian America. And as an introduction, he explains that he very well could have filled several newspaper columns with dubious statistics about the annual growth in coal and iron ore extraction, about the number of workers, and about how many years the Donetsk coal stratum could heat the entire globe. But he's not going to do that. He wants to dig deeper. And the pun here is very much intended. Because for our narrator, to understand what he calls the economic, social, and moral meaning of these developments, he will need to do more than observe the mine. He will need to actually descend. So let's take a look at the text together. And I'm showing you a passage here from the beginning. You also have it on the handout in case this is hard to see. And in the passage, we find our hero and his female companion as they approach the Gladkov mine. Their guide is a local Cossack. We read, "And there is the Gladkov mine, sir. My companion and I strain our sight, looking in the indicated direction. But how could our city eyes compare to the keen eyes of the man from the steppe? Here in this boundless expanse of petrified waves, there was not a single point, a single sign around which the Cossack Pokhlebin could orient our vision. There, where there's a little cloud, to the right of the cloud," Pokhlebin tries to direct us. If anybody's ever tried to locate something in the sky by pointing at a particularly shaped cloud to somebody else, you know that this is a losing battle, right? So he's saying, there, over there, by the cloud, he tries to direct us. We look intently at the cloud, but see nothing except the fading air, trembling from the heat in transparent streams. After just a half hour, as if crawling out from underground, a tall red factory chimney, blackened with soot on the top, appears on the horizon. And is that the Gladkov mine? That's the stack. That pulls air. So from one end, this air is let into the mine by machine, and from the other, as you see, the stack pulls it out. This is how air is moved through the mine. Without air, it's a disaster. Do they let outsiders into the mine, I ask? Well, why wouldn't they? They allow it. Then let us go have a look. Now, note here how much emphasis is put on sight, or rather the initial failure of sight to provide anything like a meaningful view of the mine. Pokhlebin points, he tries to explain, look over there next to the cloud, but their eyes, attuned as they are to city life, cannot find a place to rest. Until, that is, the factory smokestack crawls up from under the ground. Вылезает из-под земли. But it's still not really enough to understand what's going on. Pokhlebin fumbles through a description of what the chimney does until the narrator interrupts and proposes going to take a proper look. And this will require him to go underground. So what is it that he actually sees there? Well, as may not be a surprise, not a whole lot. He stands in the elevator and the platform drops into a gaping black hole. The sounds are overwhelming, the changing of gears and ropes, a puffing of steam from machines, the sound of another platform approaching with coal. Water hisses all around, sometimes in a light patter, other times more forcefully. There is something threatening in these sounds rushing from the abyss, we're told. The total darkness of the mine seems to heighten the narrator's sense of sound, but also of his body. He feels disoriented, as if he can sense himself breathing, his veins pulsing. I walked carefully with that tense, unpleasant feeling which darkness gives rise to, every minute tapping my feet along the rails running in the middle of the mine shaft. This tapping grounds our narrator, reminding him of the limits of his own body in the absence of sight. When he does see certain phenomena, they lean heavily on tropes from myth and folklore. The reddish glow emanating from the miners' lamps casts shadows along the vaulted walls of the main gallery, and these optical impressions are likened to those one might see in fairy tales from childhood. Our narrator describes subterranean caves where man-eating giants live. The mine is also called at one point a kingdom of gnomes. While evocative, these descriptive shortcuts fail to give anything like a concrete sense of what these underground spaces actually looked like. And in fact, the text continues to emphasize barriers to sight. We're told that the pit horses who are stabled in the mines have gone blind after years underground. The miners rarely light their lamps, trying to economize on the oil they have to buy themselves. And as they chip away at rock while on their backs, they must frequently stop to fish coal out of their eyes. The underground, then, is a space of frustrated, difficult, or impaired vision. It's only when he ascends to the surface that our narrator is able to see properly again. When we rose to the surface after a few minutes, the joyous feeling of light and freedom powerfully illuminated my soul. So this return to physiological vision, then, is paired with a series of social and emotional revelations. Relief, renewal, but also a sense that certain truths about the lives of these workers have been discovered. For Kuprin, the underground may not offer much to see, but it's not without its insights. Now, I want to return for a moment to Kuprin's observation about the intense noise of the underground. In descending into the mine, his narrator is overwhelmed by the threatening noises from the abyss, perhaps made more threatening because their origins are utterly invisible. Now, as it turns out, we Slavs have a famous example of such a threatening noise, which resounded for the first time on a Moscow stage in 1903. When the characters of Anton Chekhov's Cherry Orchard hear the sound of a breaking string, they speculate on its source. A heron, an owl, or, as Lapachin says, maybe somewhere far off in a mine shaft, the rope broke on a bucket, but somewhere very far off. So this is a little thing, but it's also a big thing, as so much in Chekhov is. And maybe it's also utterly forgettable until we remember that Chekhov, like Kuprin, also published his early stories in the journalistic press, and also centered many of them on the Donbas steppe. In fact, he seems to have beaten Kuprin to the punch on this count. The story Happiness was published in 1887 in the journal New Time, or Novaya Vremya. And it centers around a conversation between two locals about the possibility of a buried treasure somewhere in the steppe, an emblem for a personal fortune or happiness that might be discovered somewhere in the world. And in talking about this, all of a sudden they hear a curious noise. We read, "In the quiet air, scattering along the steppe, resounded a sound. Something gasped menacingly in the distance, hit against stone and ran across the steppe, uttering tach, 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 tach. When the sound faded away, the old man looked inquiringly at the indifferent, motionless Panteley. 'That's a bucket breaking in the mines,' said the young man, thinking." So here again we have a bucket breaking free of its rope in a mine shaft, plummeting to the ground. And again, Chekhov does not give access to the scene of the accident. We cannot see it happening. It's somewhere far off, somewhere underground, just as out of reach as the myth of the buried treasure. So this is the discursive world in which Kasatkin heads off to the Donbas, where much has been written about the Donbas in the press, but little of the underground has been shown. Much has been heard, very little has been seen. And if we consider the overwhelming darkness of Kasatkin's paintings, and we'll return to them in a moment, we can see a similar preoccupation with the mine as a space of minimal vision. Now, of course, we might also respond that this would be the only way to represent an underground mine in a realistic manner. After all, it is dark underground. How else can one represent it but darkly? But I want to emphasize that the opacity, the invisibility of the mines was not the only aesthetic or even the primary aesthetic available in this moment. Indeed, mining companies were actively trying to enlighten the public about their industry during the 1890s, to make the mine seem less like a space of threatening mystery and more like a productive, safe, modern workplace. This industry-wide imperative would have been nowhere more on display than the all-Russian Nizhny Novgorod Exhibition of Arts and Industries in 1896. Consider, for example, how visitors at the Donetsk Pavilion of coal and salt manufacturers would enter through a false stone facade as if into a mountain, only to be greeted by the stunning light-filled pavilions, with their displays made of iron railroad ties shaped into soaring arches and elaborate columns. In promotional materials for this exhibition, the potential of electric light to transform the mining process was also celebrated, even though the reality of electrifying mines in the Russian Empire was still many years out. In a certain sense, this was a fulfillment of Diderot's Enlightenment promise in his Encyclopédie, to expose and make absolutely visible the workings of industry, to flood light into the previously dark corners of the working world. This was, make no mistake, an absolute revolution. People had not been intended to go underground. Diderot's sanitizing of this dark, mystical space launched a process that would evolve into the revelatory aesthetics of realism. Shine a light, describe with care, make visible, and craggy caverns can be just as rational and knowable as the impoverished corners of the city. Underground schematics used to reveal industrial processes became a popular illustration in Russian journals as well, as we see here on the right. This, in fact, is a cross-section of the very mine that Kasatkin would go to paint in 1894. And they would have had the same intention, to make the mine seem safe and bright. This was critical for industrial development. Even as late as the 1890s, local Ukrainians in the Donbas refused to work in the mines, preferring lower-paying agricultural jobs to the dangerous, difficult work underground. The mines became even brighter with the advent of flash photography, which made these dark spaces as visible as they had ever been. The flash catching not only the bodies of the miners, but also the textures of stone and gravel and the shape of their underground networks. A review of the historical print sources on coal mining in the Russian Empire reveals the growing significance of photography for an emerging visual culture of coal. Whereas an 1895 publication, Iron and Coal in the South of Russia, included 23 engravings, a decade later, Yevgeny Kolodub's first-hand account, Labor and Life of the Miners in the Grushevsky anthracite mines, would feature over 20 photographs. In the photographs from Kolodub's book, as well as the more widely known examples by George Bretz and others, electric illumination and flash technology would produce a shared international aesthetic of coal culture. It's one that we're all familiar with to a certain extent. It's one defined by overexposed claustrophobic spaces, dramatic contrasts of light and dark, and often glittery, gleaming textures of freshly hewn rock and sweat-slicked skin. Now, Kasatkin, too, was a man of his time. Starting with his first summer in the Donbas, he began taking photographs to aid him in his creative process. In these photographs, we see the artist working out different aspects of what would become his coal aesthetic. Here, for example, the camera captures how light bounces off the edges of gravel and coal, heaped around the pulleys. These glints of light transform into the stacked brushstrokes in Kasatkin's first Donbas painting. Kasatkin also directs his lens toward the extreme contrast of industrial processes. The bright white of a fire or of molten metal set against the blackness of the surrounding environment. All that is visible is a shadowy web of machines. But consider this as well. This photograph of a coal hauler or sled man is clearly an aid for Kasatkin's 1896 work of the same subject. Now, whether or not Kasatkin had ever been allowed into the mine, a photograph like this would still have been useful as a compositional aid, a way to freeze a model in position without asking them to pose like that for hours on end. Moreover, even if Kasatkin had descended into the mine, and even if he had had a camera with a flash, which is very unlikely, it would have been tremendously difficult to capture this image in such a cramped space. It also would have been very dangerous, because it would have required the lighting of magnesium to get the appropriate flash in a very cramped space. So photography then has a clear practical function. It serves the final painting. But I also want to make another point, and that is that photography, like the enlightening mission of the Nizhny Novgorod pavilions or Diderot's cross-sections, promises something like a merciless visibility. It promises to quite literally write with light, in Russian, svetopis, to expose that which had previously been cloaked. One way of understanding Kasatkin's later Donbas pictures, then, is as a resistance to this literal and figurative illumination. He leverages the opacity of paint, of oil paint, casting the miners and their world back into shadow. He layers pigment upon pigment as a material counter-argument to the transparency of the photographic negative and a refusal of the revelatory promise of his earlier realism. So to paint it black, this was a bold choice. What would it mean to produce a painting that was nearly impervious to vision? When Kasatkin debuted Coal Miners' Shift Change at the 24th Annual Передвижники exhibition in 1896, he was met with a good amount of initial praise. Viewers seemed to appreciate his novel take on the difficult work of mining. The reviewer in Ruskие Ведомости, for example, wrote that the picture transports the viewer to the bowels of a coal furnace. It is entirely black, and its palette from first glance is almost inscrutable. Everything in it is black. The shelter over the underground mine, the earth, the air, the people, their face, their hands, their clothing. But there was also predictably some criticism as well. After hearing that the famous collector Pavel Tretyakov had purchased the work, another collector marveled at Kasatkin's chimney sweeps and held forth on how an artist should offer cheerful colors, paint the sun, and not black coal. Another wrote in a review that it was all so blackly painted that one might think that coal dust had covered the freshly painted canvas. And still another observed that, unfortunately, after a few years, the dark background may deepen, and then the painting will turn into a solid black blot, which of course it mostly has, but not entirely. Close and prolonged scrutiny, this is the right slide, okay. Close and prolonged scrutiny reveals a multifigural composition centered on an elevator which transports workers to and from the mine shaft. Exiting the elevator and walking straight toward the viewer are two miners with two more shadowy figures behind them. Their eyes glow against blackened skin, echoing the flames of their lamps. The central figure holds an axe and strides with a determination befitting his status as an obvious hero of the picture. So this is where I'm looking here in this gray square. And again, it may be better on your handout in this moment. Flanking the shaft elevator are crowds of men waiting to take their place in the underground. It also, by the way, if you hold it up, sometimes shines enough light through that you can start to see the compositional features. So there's trick, you have to maneuver this work. So flanking the shaft elevator are crowds of men waiting to take their place in the underground tunnels for their 12-hour shift. And in noticing them, we recall the persistent cyclical nature of shift work, divorced from the natural rhythms of the day. This is a world where the movement of the sun and moon across the sky mean very little, despite the subtle suggestion of pre-dawn light struggling to make its way through the windows. What this gray light does manage to reveal is a crisscrossing network of beams and pulleys along the building's ceiling. All else is cast into shadow, including a figure sitting on a stool in the lower left corner of the picture, who may very well be a substitute for the artist observing the scene. And more time before the painting reveals even more details. A sleeping child on the floor in the left middle ground, tools leaned upon, a cart glinting in the lamplight on the right side of the canvas. But this, as you're discovering right now, takes work. The picture does not give itself up easily. Writing about another tradition of dark painting at the end of the 19th century, nocturnes or night landscapes, art historian Hélène Valence has argued that the vogue for such nocturnes can largely be seen as a reaction to the culture of heightened technological visibility. Not only the electric light that illuminated urban spaces, but also X-rays and flash photography and all of the epistemological metaphors that went with them. And so night painters resisted this, offering instead something of an anti-painting, painting that refused to traffic in light effects and instead embraced inscrutability. Now, the Russian Empire, of course, also had its tradition of nocturnes. And in the example of Arkhip Kuinji, we see much of the same effects that Valence observes in American paintings. Mainly that this rejection of vision requires a more intense, prolonged act of looking. After all, science tells us that it takes 20 to 40 minutes for our eyes to adjust in the dark. And so these works require an extended visual absorption from the beholder. I think this is what we see unfolding in Kasatkin's picture. Faced with the challenge of picturing this new industrial world, he gets to work as well. And he creates a visual field that requires us as viewers to go on that journey with him, to linger, to allow our eyes to adjust, to wait for these miners and their workspaces to reveal themselves. Look again at the miners, their faces blending with the dark around them. In Kuprin's sketch, which we read earlier, a local warns the narrator correspondent that he will emerge from the mine black from head to toe. And this physical transformation of the miner seems to be front of mind for Kasatkin as well. Darkness sticks to the miners in the form of dust caked onto the skin, but also an unknowability that haunts the figures, that makes them impermeable, barely distinguishable from the background, somehow both psychologically intense and absolutely alien in their fusion with the material world. But I also want to be clear here, there is a definite threat being implied. There is something mysterious happening underground, something that condenses in the bodies and minds of the miners. The blackened skin is a visual trace, but also, of course, a suggestion of the social, even racial otherness of industrial laborers. In British and American coal culture, this connection between the colonial or slave labor that builds empires, that fuels economies, that reshapes the land, and racial blackness was often made, and almost always referenced as a simmering threat, bubbling below the surface, threatening to overturn the societies it had built. So when we view these two works by Kasatkin, made 30 years later during a trip to Wales, it is now impossible not to see the blackness of the coal miner's face as a racial category, the painting insistent on turning white skin black. The potential political threat of the miners was evident already by the middle of the 1890s, when there had already been revolts in the Donbas mines. And several reviewers would take note of the phosphorescent eyes of Kasatkin's miners. So despite their darkness, these paintings always featured some kind of aberrant light, a dimly glowing lamp, a flash of an eye, a glint reflecting from a tool, molten metal, a spark in the dark. Writing years later of this series, Kasatkin saw this spark as latent political energy. The miner, despite all of its dullness, stood for a riotous element. As a person whose life was always in danger while working, his extreme irritability and nervousness also constituted his strength, were saturated with his energy. All that was needed was a spark to bring down this energy onto his long-standing enemy. So all that was needed was a spark. Look at the flame in the detail from coal miners' shift change. Not at all an elusive, flickering vapor, this is a thick application of paint. Some late 19th century painting manuals listed coal itself as a possible ingredient in certain black pigments of paint. It's tempting then to extend the unstable energy of coal and its miners to the materiality of Kasatkin's paintings, to their heavily applied pigments, their overwhelmingly black palette. Light a match and the whole picture might ignite. So this is what the Donbas teaches Kasatkin in the 1890s, about the possibility of a late realist aesthetic. Illumination, revelation, and exposure are no longer necessary for a meaningful picture of labor. Instead, we have a world and a painting that have been cast outside the bounds of the visible. Now, while the end results of this labor might have been increasingly more discernible to the Russian populace, most notably in the rapidly expanding railroad lines that were crisscrossing the empire, the difficult, dangerous work of mining was still mostly beyond view. Done far from the centers of Moscow and St. Petersburg, done below the ground, processed in dark foundries, by men whose very skin had been darkened by years of such work. So if realism had promised a certain kind of visual knowability of these previously obscure spaces, then Kasatkin here comes up against its limits. The underground and the people of the underground reclaim their invisibility. And in doing so, they turn the lights off on a certain strain of realism. They push it into new territory. Kasatkin's is a realism that withholds and resists, and it gives rise to a painting that seeks to absorb the material and political energy of coal itself. Now, in closing, I want to offer two final thoughts. And the first has to do with how we as scholars undertake these kinds of research excavations. Much of the preliminary work for this talk was completed prior to 2022 and the escalation of the Russian war in Ukraine. And at that time, I was able to do deep dives into the growing online databases of Russian collections. And I found an impressive cache of work from smaller regional museums and archives, much of which I've shown you today. Since then, the access that we have in the United States to the primary collection database, Goskatalog, has been suspended. And travel to Russian and Ukrainian archives that would make more such work possible is also without reach. So how do we continue to unearth new histories? Honestly, I don't have a great answer to this question right now, other than to take inspiration from the subterranean as a space of subversion. Should we move our methods underground? Are there ways of trading material, launching collaborations, aiding colleagues that can and must be done in the dark? In this, we might also look to the people of Ukraine who have moved underground, sheltering in subways, shielding themselves from view. On the 25th day after the escalation last February, the Ukrainian artist Yevgenia Belarusets wrote this in her war diary. "All the windows are blacked out and the lights are off, as in all the apartments I can see when I peek out my window. One tries to make oneself invisible, to hide one's house and sink into the darkness of the night so as not to become a target." Meanwhile, international environmental agencies have been sounding the alarm about the aging mines in the Donbas, under existential threat by Russian bombing. A neglected or abandoned mine could flood and contaminate local water supplies. Miners could be trapped in a collapsed mine brought down by rockets. In so many ways, then, the people of Ukraine and of the Donbas continue to live with the world that Kasatkin and Kuprin and Chekhov captured over 100 years ago. This, then, is a centuries-long environmental, political, and artistic history that may have sunken from view for a while, but right now is rising up with fury in this moment. So with that, I thank you so much for your attention today, and I'm very, very happy to answer any questions or receive suggestions. Thank you.
Okay, so we have some time for questions for Professor Brunson. If you have questions, please raise your hand, and you mind.
I can feel them. We'll start in the front.
So I was really interested in like the faces of the eyes when we compare that early, I think it was an earlier painting, the poor gathering coal. Like they're outside, right? They're in the light, but you don't see any of their faces.
Yeah.
Right. They're all, which seems really intentionally covered. And then in the underground paintings, it's almost all you see, right? Glowing eyes, and a lot of them are face forward. And you show other paintings where the faces are really prominent. I'm just wondering what you think of that.
It's a really great observation. What do I think about that? So I think there's probably a practical answer to that question, which is that it took time for Kasatkin to establish productive relationships with the local workers. And I think that first summer was a challenging one for him. We read about this a lot in his responses to the harshness of the environment. We also know that maybe one of the reasons he chose to go to the Donbas specifically and paint this subject is that one of his good friends, another painter, another Peredvishnik, whose name is Nikolai Kasatkin, had a family dacha in Kislovodsk. And so whenever it got really bad, he would go to Kislovodsk, which is a spa town, and sort of enjoy the environment. So I think he actually had limited contact with the harshness of this space in that first summer that he paints Poor Gathering Coal. And he does sort of what he'd been doing all along, which is these sort of, again, socially inflected genre paintings set out in a kind of pastoral landscape. At least it's one here that's been dug up, but it's working with similar sort of conventions of landscape painting. And so, in other words, I think his actual access to individual models and people was probably limited in that moment. In fact, there's a way in which, I mean, you could see this particular painting as basically a sort of later citation of Millet's Gleaners. If you have the sort of women leaning over, sort of gleaning, right? I mean, so it's a certain kind of like realist cliche. So it's questionable whether he's working with actual models here.
It reminds me a lot of like the Courbet.
Exactly. It's like, yeah, exactly right. I mean, I had an art historian once tell me it's like a cross between the Stonebreakers and the Gleaners. Yeah. Like, this is what we're seeing here. So, you know, like, is he just working with tropes of realist paintings about labor and not actually observing physical models in the way that he would subsequently? And we have a lot of, from the 1895 and 1896, really detailed character studies. So it's clear that he is observing specific individuals, and that becomes a part of that process.
It's less like in, you know, the light of day and kind of the public eye, you are kind of faceless, but
yeah.
in the dark you can kind of more be yourself. It's kind of where I
yeah.
with it, but you think it's more like an access to models?
I think that's part of it. I think there's also a sort of bigger part that you can sort of get to this question about sort of emotional and political intensity that he really wants to underline in the later works of these actual miners, where looking into those eyes or having the eyes shining out, this sort of, and it's repeated again and again in the reviews that they're phosphorescent eyes, yeah. Right? So there is this sense of a kind of glowing, partly supernatural, but also like natural, like super dash natural, right? I mean, it's sort of the elements of the earth itself sort of coming up in some sort of a sort of revolt, or at least promising a kind of revolt. So I do think there's a kind of political argument behind it as well. But yeah, I mean, you see it throughout the works, and the character studies of those miners are so amazing. And I do think part of what he's trying to capture is this, again, real characteristic of what happens to people when they work in mines year after year after year, which is that you cannot actually get the blackness off the skin. Right? It's just sort of there permanently. And so he's trying to also represent that reality, right? The sense that it actually, these kinds of labor conditions transform you physically into a different kind of a creature. So there's that too. I think there was a question here.
Yeah, I was wondering, do you know if the miners themselves ever had access to the paintings and writings about them, and what their reaction to those things were?
That's a great question. Paintings, probably not. Probably not, because they go back to the centers, and I mean, they travel a little bit in the way that the Wanderers exhibitions travel, but they're not reaching working class audience, certainly. I mean, if anything, it's a sort of upper middle class audience they're reaching. So probably not the paintings, but we do have one example, or I have one example that comes to mind immediately, which is one of the sort of historical sources I mentioned, this book by Yevgeny Kolodub, who did work in the mines. And then he writes this memoir in 1903, initially, and it gets republished in 1905 with these photographs that had been made underground. So he's clearly aware of the kind of emerging visual culture of labor and industry, but he doesn't comment on it explicitly. They are just sort of illustrations that have been tipped into the book itself. So we don't have any documentation of what actual miners would have thought of these works, or of a kind of general corpus of underground representation. Although it would be nice to know.
Anyway, take the question, but everyone else has their hand up. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the Donbas as an imperial space,
yeah.
And a transnational space. And the imperial side of things, I mean, you have, as you mentioned, there's sort of local Ukrainians. There's also huge amounts of migration that's sort of happening to Donbas, to work in the mines from all over the empire, and some foreign involvement too, and then this racialized other rate that's sort of going on, as well as the associations. I think are very much there.
Yeah.
Of mining being something that's sort of often farmed out to colonies, like certainly by the British, with sort of Africa, and then the transnational dimension too. I mean, I'm struck by this Russian America thing. So what's going on with that, and sort of how are the imperial dynamics sort of playing out as you see them, or sort of as you see them both in representation and sort of the movements maybe of the artists themselves, or critiquing them.
I'm going to scroll through a bunch here while I start to talk. Thank you for the questions, because this is also the historical context here and the imperial context is such an interesting part of this story. I'll start by saying that initially when I started this project, it began because I agreed to give a talk at a conference on the energy humanities. And I initially said, okay, I haven't worked on anything like this. I work primarily in aesthetics. But then I thought some more, and I'd always wanted to work on this painting I'll show you by Alexander Denieka from the 1920s. Here it is. This painting here, and he has a cycle of paintings from Donbas, and I'd always wanted to work on it. And so I was like, okay, I'll give a talk on this painting. And the first step was I was like, okay, I have to figure out the history of mining in the Donbas. So I start looking into the history of mining in the Donbas. And I discover that actually it's going to take me back again, right? I'm probably not going to end up writing on this painting, which I didn't. And I got sucked back to the 19th century again. Because after these initial sort of geological sort of surveys that are done of the region, the next big phase of development is in the second half of the 19th century. And if we think in particular about the city of Donetsk, it originates in the 1870s by a Welsh mining engineer and entrepreneur named John Hughes. And so the original name of Donetsk is actually Yuzovka, from Hughes. So it's one of these like delightful Russifications of a Welsh name. And it is predominantly an international community in the second half of the 19th century. Those who are coming there to work in the mines are coming from Great Britain, make up a huge portion of these individuals settling this area. The other workers coming in are largely, at Yuzovka in particular, are largely coming from northern Russia. And there are a lot of seasonal laborers coming sort of in the off season after harvest season, then they'll come down and make more money in the mines and then return. A lot are coming from the Urals, a lot of technicians are coming from the Urals. And so the mines themselves are largely being worked by a sort of broad migrant population. And again, the locals who were sort of native to this region, for the most part, are quite antagonistic towards all of the sort of migrant labor, but also these international businessmen and entrepreneurs coming in. In addition to John Hughes, at the other mines, there are a lot of Germans, there are a lot of Belgians, there are some Americans. It is a deeply, deeply international community. And it's largely defined in the second half of the 19th century by this sort of split between the native population and this influx of sort of industrial entrepreneurs and laborers. And so this really defines the Donbas as a region from day one. This is a part of its identification. And it's only in the Soviet period in 1920s and 1930s that this sort of foreign investment in the area and foreign presence in the area gets almost sort of wiped out of the histories, or at least from the sort of visual and literary representations. And the Donetsk then becomes the space of Soviet labor, writ large, not, of course, like foreign capitalist investment. And so that's the kind of sort of long history of this transnational set of relationships. What's interesting about the sort of the projection of race on the laborers is that I sort of wondered for a while whether or not that was really there, right? Or whether I was projecting. And so I'm glad that you accept that interpretation. But the other piece of it that kind of convinced me on this front was that I ended up reading a review by the sort of leading art critic at the time, Vladimir Stasov, who was writing about the Adolf Menzel, the sort of German painter's painting of an iron rolling mill. And he calls the workers in that mill arapi. And so there's this sense of sort of laborers and industrial laborers as black people in particular, and as black sort of colonized people. And so that then clearly seems to be a part of the kind of artistic discourse in this time. And that's sort of what I'm working with. And it does seem as if there's such an aggressive blackening of the skin that becomes a part of it. That, I think, is probably exacerbated by the fact that you are getting sort of ethnic minorities also coming in as migrant workers in this area. And so there is also that component of this question as well. In fact, one of the reasons that Kuprin writes this sketch, or that he gives the reason for this sort of journalistic sketch, is he says, look, everybody in the area talks about like how badly behaved these sort of migrant laborers are who come in, and they do all of these terrible things. They drink too much, they carouse too much, they're this horrible influence on our local region. His whole point for writing this thing and going down into the mines is to try to shed some light on their world and their humanity, and to say, look, there's a reason they act like this. Their life is really hard, right? And so it's a kind of humanizing process and a way to kind of stave off this sort of imperial othering that I think is absolutely already set in by this point in time. That gives a little bit of it. Yeah.
One last question.
I find it interesting how the artist obviously has access to images of mines,
Yeah.
and is also drawing potentially on tropes, and
Yeah.
kind of potentially uses some trope to that he sets in this whole area. So then why go there? It almost seems like an ethnographic
Yeah.
project. And is that, I guess I want to know more about the context of artists doing that. So what pushes him to go there if he seems to have access to images, and then what comes out of these images is something that we really can't see.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
find that very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it's good. This is part of what realism gives to painterly training in the second half of the 19th century. So that when painters, so somebody like Ilya Repin, this most important painter of the early realist moment in Russia, when he studies at the Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg in the 1860s and early 1870s, his training would have involved a classical academic training that you would have gotten in any academy all over Europe. And the training would have consisted of copying etchings and engravings of masterpieces, then moving on to sort of copying the works themselves in front of you, and then moving on to life study, sort of drawing live bodies, nudes, and so on in classrooms, in studios. Only then would you be allowed to put together your own composition. But nowhere in that process was go out and do field research and get a firsthand sense of the environment. This is what realism adds to academic training. It says, no. If you want to paint reality as such, you have to actually go out and have proximity to your subjects, right? You have to do research like an ethnographer. That's part of it, because it has this sort of scientific underpinning that you are accessing a certain kind of truth by gaining this proximity. And so that's what Repin does in 1870. He goes down the Volga River and finds these barge haulers that he will inevitably paint. And it's that research and the many sketches and many studies that underwrites these projects that sort of give them this sense of accuracy, of proximity, of completeness, that you've done your research, you've been there, and that gives it this sense of truth, right? Or at least that's the illusion it's setting off. So Kasatkin was trained by that first generation of realists. So that would have been part of the process. He would have done all of the normal stuff. He would have learned how to draw. He would have had, life drawing classes, all of those things he would have done. But they also would have said, no, to actually do this, you have to go there. You have to go and see it, and that's going to be a part of the process. So he's sort of doing the thing that a realist does. What's interesting is what happens, right? Which is exactly your point, is that when he goes there, he actually just doesn't see very much. Or if he does, he then actively decides to make it hard to see. And so it is then sort of beginning with this realist convention of traveling there, seeing something firsthand, doing all of the preparatory work you need to do, and then he covers it all up. And that's a really profound choice. It's a really strange moment where he then denies that kind of access to the scene that realism had always sought to offer its viewers. And so it's in my sense then, he really is playing with this sort of fundamental thing that his teachers had taught him to do and pushing it into a new direction. The new direction you could see as in some sense the kind of pinnacle or culmination of realism, look, I'm going to do something that in fact gets to this, what it's actually like to be underground and not be able to see anything. Or you could argue that what we're seeing here is the kind of tipping over into symbolism. And that's also absolutely present. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we're out of time, but I want to thank you all for coming. I want to reiterate the thanks to Ezra Predalot for helping organize this visit, and Megan Luttrell for really laying the groundwork and also promoting it. And please join me in thanking Professor Brunson for sharing her exciting new work.
Thanks, everyone.